This is our third Sunday that I've been assigned to teach, so this is my last one. Of course, I missed the first one because I was sick, so it's really only my second Sunday if you're trying to keep count. For those of you who weren't here last week, my name is Peter Gathje, and I teach at Memphis Theological Seminary in the area of Christian ethics. So it's fun for me to be able to be invited to come to this church and to talk about the New Testament because I don't know anything about it. So I'm kind of in the same boat as you, as educated laypersons who try to understand what's going on in the Gospels. That's kind of what we're narrowing the New Testament down to the Gospels today. And we're further narrowing it down because you had an assigned reading. And I'm curious because last week when I asked who did the assigned reading, only one person raised her hand, and she is here today. And she did again. So anybody else do the assigned reading just out of curiosity? Yay, we've more than doubled the number in 1 week. So that's excellent. So for those of you who didn't do the reading, I'm going to narrow things down even more significantly to a particular issue that I saw running through the readings for this week. And that issue is something that I think doesn't get talked about enough in Christian circles quite often because we're a little bit afraid of it, it seems. And that's the whole issue or theme of power. I've heard lots of sermons, not in this church, but in other churches that would lead one to believe that if we're going to be disciples of Jesus, we should renounce power. And that scares me, quite frankly, because we need power. Power is a really important thing in our lives. Those who don't have power are often seeking power, and those who do have power are often misusing it. And most of us are somewhere kind of in the middle. We have some power, but we don't have absolute power. In fact, I'm not sure who does have absolute power. But I want us to first, before we get into some of the stories, is to think about power and sort of pool our common wisdom and try to arrive at some understanding of this word power, what it might mean. So let's just do some brainstorming to begin about what comes to mind when we hear the word power. So what comes to mind when you hear the word power? There's a direct question. Authority, okay. Influence. Control. Ego. I'm sorry? Okay. And I didn't quite hear the first word. Internal. Okay. Internal control. Internal direction over our thoughts, our actions. Any other thoughts about power? When you hear that word? Monarchy, kings and queens, even a kingdom perhaps, even a kingdom of God. Misuse. Options. So we all have some sense, given that lots of folks have spoken, we have some sense of what power is. We have some experience either as being folks who have power and use power, and sometimes also folks who have had power used upon them or done to them in some way. Let me try to kind of organize our thoughts a little bit, and I'm going to give a handout, and that's going to take me off camera for a few seconds, but that's okay. The power I have is to move around. There'll be more than enough of those things on power. And that is a kind of basic understanding of power, which is the ability to get things done. So if you have power, if I have power, we can do things. One of the things I did to get here this morning was I got behind the wheel of a very powerful vehicle that propelled me down Poplar Avenue at approximately 40 miles an hour. It was really wonderful. It's called a car. And that's a powerful vehicle. So we can think of power that we have power over just by steering. Sometimes we have power over others. If you look at the back of that little handout, sometimes we can think of hard power or power over. That can be coercive, controlling. Sometimes it comes through threats or violence, reward, punishment. This sometimes disempowers others. Oftentimes this kind of power is viewed as a win-loss proposition. If I have this kind of power, you don't. By definition. If I have power over you, then your power is minimal or non-existent. Or at least it appears that way. And then there's what gets called a soft power or power with, a power of cooperation. Lots of things probably happen in this church because people come together and cooperate with each other. I can't imagine, for example, that whole Lenten preaching series, all the people that must be involved with that to make that happen each year. That's a cooperative power. The power of compassion. This kind of power enables other people. We share power. We're working together to get things done. Sometimes this power can be viewed then as a win-win. When we have this power together, it doesn't mean that you have less power or I have more power, but we're sharing power. Power can get exercised in various ways. We could have ideological or cultural or knowledge power. That's kind of the business that I'm in. When students come into my classroom, they think that they're going to learn something, and they are so obedient. They sit there, they write things down or type it on the computer, and I don't even have to tell them to do it. I have so much power. They just immediately submit because they think that I have something worthwhile to say. It's kind of like you this morning. You all obediently filed in, you took a handout, and you're sitting quietly and not disturbing the peace because you think, well, maybe he has something important to say. That's a kind of ideological or cultural power. We're willing to listen to people. That can be religious power. You were just here a little while ago, and you had people up front wearing interesting costumes and saying, I hope, interesting things. And there you were out in the pews willing to listen and to learn and to follow their leadership because you think that they have a power that you would like to participate in called the power of God. And churches that have a kind of nice hierarchy like the Episcopal Church does even has great symbols of the transference of that power in things like ordination. So there's all sorts of interesting aspects of power within a church, though, as Reverend Eileen said, what was your official title again? Associate Rector, that she knows what it's like not to have power. Because we are commiserating, I'm Associate Dean at the seminary, and how do we get power? And I ran into one of your fellow parishioners who used to be a dean at the University of Memphis, and we were both talking about how we have to use a certain, not hard power, but soft power in order to get anything done with faculty, because sometimes they're described, being a dean is like herding cats. And you know you can't just force a cat to do something. So then there's the power that we probably think more obviously about, of economic power, the power of wealth, political power. Since we are coming up to elections again, does it ever stop? There's going to be a lot of emphasis on who's worthy of having political power. Then there's military power, police power. That's often a power that gets exercised through a kind of violence, or at least the threat of violence. Though really good policing rarely uses violence, as any good police officer will tell you. So those are ways that that power gets exercised. And then, of course, in business leadership, how many folks in here are in business? A few. So have you taken any leadership courses and things like that? So you've already learned something about power, right? And there are these theorists from back in the 1960s, John French and Bertram Raven, and they talked about different types of power within a business setting. We're not going to go all over all of those. I really wanted us to see those as kind of variations on this theme of power. That power is a lot more complicated and interesting than just I can tell you or force you to do certain things. And so that's all by way of introduction. Now let's talk about the Gospels. So I'm going to read, for those of you who didn't get a chance to read, I'm just going to read a kind of listing of the things that went on that you would have read about. And for those of you who did do the reading, this will be a nice little memory jogger. Matthew 17, the Transfiguration. We're going to come back to that. And that was in all of the Gospels except for John. John doesn't have the Transfiguration, which I find really fascinating. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple, the cursing of the fig tree. Jesus' authority gets questioned. Then he tells some parables. The feeding of the 4,000, a demand for a sign. He cures a blind man at Bethsaida. Peter declares about Jesus that he is the Christ after Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And the Christ, of course, is a title of power, the anointed one. The Transfiguration, the coming of Elijah, the healing of a boy with a spirit. A rival exorcist, what a great story. Someone else is going around casting out demons in the name of Jesus who's not a disciple. It's sort of like he was a Baptist and not an Episcopalian, so can we really trust his authority? And Jesus said, yeah, you can trust that authority as long as he's doing good with it. The rich man, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? More healings. And then, of course, we've got also the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus. So he's going to encounter the power of the Roman Empire and that religious elite that was working closely with the Roman Empire. You might hear in all of that why I picked up on the issue of power. Jesus is doing a lot of things that threaten the way things are. That's why he gets himself arrested. People don't like what he's doing. And so there's a power struggle going on. And so let's go to the Transfiguration because that's a really powerful story about power. So you all know the story, right? So who wants to tell the story? Of the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus. I need a good storyteller because I'm not a very good storyteller. And I don't want to just read it because then it's too familiar. So who wants to volunteer to tell the story of the Transfiguration? Who wants to be so powerful that they will stand up and preach the gospel for just a few minutes to just tell the story? See, that's the problem with Episcopalians. They're so quiet and polite. You will do it. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Excellently told. Thank you. Now I'm going to ask you a Bible study question, which is Jesus before the Transfiguration and after the Transfiguration is telling the future about something that's going to happen. Do you know what he was foretelling? His death and resurrection. He does that several times. And if you go to all of the three Gospels that have the transfiguration, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what you'll notice is a pattern that's followed by all three of Jesus foretelling his death, Jesus foretelling his death, transfiguration, Jesus foretelling his death and resurrection, right? So in the midst of Jesus kind of warning his disciples that the free lunches are about to end, we have this imagery of Jesus as very powerful. In fact, God says about him in this story, "This is my beloved Son," which echoes in Mark's gospel what had happened when Jesus was baptized, right? "This is my beloved Son," and then we're told to listen to him, right? And so God, who we definitely regard as powerful, is telling us that Jesus has the same power. Now, we have to think for a bit, what is that power? Let's go back to a consideration of power. What kind of power does God have, and what kind of power does Jesus have as God's beloved? If we were looking through this list. Yeah, it's a soft power for the most part, at least. It seems like a soft power. It's the power of persuasion. It's the power of cooperation and shared compassion. It's one of the ways we know that it's a shared power is that Jesus sends his disciples out to do the same things that he was doing. To heal people, cast out demons, and preach. And lo and behold, they do it. They have the same power. One of the fascinating things about being a disciple of Jesus is that we don't just cower under the power of the guy up in the tower, but rather it's power that's shared. So you all just celebrated, in fact, in this very space not too long ago, the sharing of Jesus' power in the Eucharist. That's why Jesus instituted the Eucharist, so that we would remember what his power is and how we share that power. As Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians, he quotes Jesus as saying, "Do this in remembrance of me." And why do we want to remember? Because as we remember, we are shaped in that power. We are empowered, just like the first disciples, to go and heal and to cast out demons and to teach, to preach the good news, to share the good news that we have the power. Question? Oh, I want contrarians. Yes. And I'm glad that you asked that question. I'm going to go back here so I'm on camera again. Did he also exercise coercive power? Yeah, certainly in casting out the demons. And there's another story from this week's reading in which he did some coercive power as well. Yeah, at the temple, the cleansing of the temple. Jesus drives out the money changers, right? He goes in. I mean, he's creating quite a commotion. He overturns tables. I mean, he's using some coercive, or he's trying to use some coercive power there, for certain. Does God ever use coercive power? Do we have any stories from either the Old or the New Testaments? Jonah, that's a pretty good one. It's a really funny one, too. How about the Exodus story? I mean, that's a biggie. So we've got that hard power as well that God will use on occasion. And then, so we have to ask, what kind of power are we being invited into as disciples of Jesus? Is it soft power? Is it hard power? Is it a little bit of both? What do you think? A little bit of both? I mean, because hard power, I didn't put up there bad power. All right, it's more of a neutral description. This is a kind of power. Power gets bad when it's being used to do what? Evil. And let's try to narrow that or make that a little more of a definition. What does evil look like? What happens when evil is done? Yes, it does. But see, I'm an ethicist, so I'm not going to be a relativist. So we're going to have to come up with something that we could say it's not going to matter in some respects where you're standing. This would still be evil. So in other words, this is evil whether you are above or below or somewhere in the middle, if power is being used to do this. Diminish or harm another person. And that is our intentionality, and that is the result, is that we want to harm the person by exercising this power. And let me give you an easy example. How many folks in here are parents? How many times have you had to use a little coercive power on one of your loved ones? Right? And I'm not talking about like even spanking or anything. I'm sometimes moving them, right? Or removing them from something that could hurt them. And some folks will say, oh, you should never lay hands on a child. People who say that probably their children are either dead or didn't get raised very well, because children need to be moved. And sometimes it needs to be coercive. Sometimes it can be cooperative. When I was waiting to come in, I saw a dad who was being coercive with one kid, was carrying the kid, and the other kid they were holding hands. And that young child was just kind of following along cooperatively. And then the one who was holding hand broke away and started to run. And the dad used his power of voice, kind of authority, and that didn't work, as sometimes it doesn't. So then he went and grabbed the child and pulled the child back. That's coercive power. And at a bigger scale, sometimes we have to move people or stand between folks who are in conflict and say, don't do that. So coercive power is a legitimate form of power if we're using it for the well-being of the person who the power is being exercised upon. So even like putting somebody in jail or prison, that can be a good power for the protection of that person so they don't do more evil, and also for the protection of the broader society so that evil is not done again. And what we would want, if we're thinking about where that coercive power might go, we want to create a coercive power that is going to guide people into the right and the good. And so maybe our prisons and jails, we have a lot of work to do around that issue. That's a whole nother talk. But I just want to use that as an example of how coercive power can sometimes be for the good. So I'm glad you were a contrarian and raised the issue. I want us to think a little bit more about some of the power that Jesus was exercising. So I'm going to go to one of the particular stories. Or let me do this. Those of you who did the reading, was there a story that you came across that you said, I'm not sure what's going on there, or I have some questions about it? And for those of you who didn't do the reading, know that the reading was so broad, almost anything that you would raise from the story of Jesus will be a legitimate question. I'm going to start with those who did their homework. Did you come across a story of Jesus using power that you wondered, what the heck is going on here? And they're being quiet, so yes, go ahead.
Okay, I did read it, but I'm always, it's always very interesting to me when Jesus says or does something, and then he says, don't tell anyone. And so I always find that intriguing, and I look around and, find one answer, another answer, but nothing really satisfactory. What's your take on it?
I'm going to give you the answer that I learned when I studied the Gospels. And then we'll see whether or not it's a satisfactory answer, okay? This is especially there's this theory, of course, that the three Gospels that we call the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that we've got Mark's Gospel, and Luke and Matthew relied upon Mark's Gospel as a source, and then there's this argument that there was this other source that was a sane source, the Q source, Quelle in German. So you've got Mark and Q, and Matthew and Luke are drawing on Mark and Q. So this whole business about Jesus telling people to be quiet or not tell seems to come from Mark rather than Q. And so Mark, biblical scholars look at Mark's gospel and they see that theme runs through Mark's gospel. And so one of them, I can't remember who came up with the phrase, but one of those smart fellows or ladies came up with the phrase of the messianic secret. The messianic secret. And here's what these biblical scholars have argued, is that Mark was concerned that the people who were reading his gospel wouldn't really understand the nature of Jesus' power. Because they thought that, Jesus is Messiah. What does that mean? Well, it can mean, actually, within a Jewish setting, it can mean a lot of different things. There's not like one idea of Messiah that typified all of Judaism. But one of the ideas within Judaism that Mark is particularly concerned about is Messiah as a king who has power over. And I think Mark is concerned about that because, well, maybe for several reasons, but one is if Jesus has all the power over, then where's our power? What are we called to become as disciples? If all the power is above us, then where's our power? So Mark wants to counter that emphasis on a power above with a power with. And so whenever Jesus exercises power, and so it often comes up when he heals somebody, right? Afterwards, Jesus says, like, don't tell anybody. Or I heal the blind, don't tell anybody. What's Jesus getting at in Mark's telling of the story is, one possibility, this messianic secret explanation, is that Jesus, Mark, we're not sure who came up with this approach, but that the point of it is to help us to get a better sense of what is the power of Jesus as Messiah. What do you think of that?
I think that's the best explanation I've heard today.
I like the qualifier today.
Well, women always have this reserve that change their mind.
That's your power, right? So it is, some of us might follow Jesus with the sense that we're following Jesus in order to have power over others. And so we have to be careful about what is the power that we have. And what I mean by power over here is not just like the coercive power I'm talking about. Let me use a different phraseology. A destructive power, a dehumanizing power, a power that denigrates others as human beings. And sometimes the power of God can be seen that way by some folks and used that way by some folks. Of course, none of us would ever do that, right? And it's a temptation, I think, with power, is that when I have power and I think I can do a lot of good with it, I might be more willing to jump into coercion. It's like when I get frustrated with other people, then I want to force them to do what I think is good. And that's a temptation for us. We have to be really careful about that kind of exercise of power. Now remember, just a few minutes ago I said that kind of power can sometimes be for the good, right? So there's no simple walk out of here and say, I should never use that kind of power. Jesus used that kind of power. We use that kind of power. And so the question is not, should we use that kind of power? The question is, how are we using it? And that's what the Messianic Secret's trying to get at. How is Jesus using his power? It's a power that's different from the power of the Roman Empire. And it's a power that's different from the ruling class that was working with the Roman Empire. Those are the folks who were trying to use their power and authority to just control people. And the cross, in terms of Roman power, was the ultimate symbol of that power. And it's interesting that us Christians, I'll just turn around for a minute and see there's a little cross right there. There's one right here too. And there's one in the stained glass, right? We've taken this symbol of Roman power and we've subverted it. We've overturned it, or more accurately, God has overturned it through the power of the resurrection, which we get to celebrate in a few more weeks, particularly, though we celebrate it every Sunday. So there is that kind of, the power of the cross can go both ways, so to speak. And I think Jesus, and Mark certainly as well, was concerned that we as disciples of Jesus might just continue the old cycle of power, which is the way that the world generally works. So that's crucial. And I think the Transfiguration is trying to get us, by the way it's placed, is trying to get us to think about that as well. One of the things that we kind of have to hold in tension as we think about power is kind of visions of power. So we've got visions of Jesus healing and serving others and teaching. And then we have a vision of the cross and the resurrection. And in the middle of that, we've got the vision of the Transfiguration. And some biblical scholars would say that the Transfiguration is really a resurrection story put earlier into the gospel. I don't know about all that. I just know how it works in terms of the story itself: foretelling death, Transfiguration, foretelling death, death, resurrection. It's like foreshadowing, which every good story has, right? Other questions about Jesus's, or mysteries of Jesus's power? Yes, sir. Say it again. Did everybody hear the question? Was there ever a time which Jesus said, "Don't tell," and the person actually didn't go and tell? I can't think of one off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. I think what Mark is trying to get at, and then Matthew and Luke pick it up. That's where we get it also in Matthew and Luke, though the emphasis on it declines a bit in those two Gospels. I think what Mark was trying to do, and the way in which he was telling the story, was, here's the power of Jesus. It can be easily misunderstood, and yet we're still going to tell the story. That's how I would try to think through it. So just because we have this kind of dynamite of a story, and it's dangerous in a way, and one of the ways we can see how dangerous it is to just look at the history of Christianity and the all sorts of bad stuff that's been done in the name of Christianity. So, and it's been done by people, I think a lot of those folks were probably well-intentioned. Not all of them, but some of them I'm guessing were. And yet they were using the story in a way that led not to human good, but to human destruction. And so we've got to be careful with this story. And yet we still have to keep telling it. And why do we have to keep telling it? Because it's a way in which we can live in the truth, even though it's a dangerous story. And I get frustrated sometimes. I have friends on kind of across the spectrum politically and across the spectrum religiously. And I get frustrated sometimes with folks who have become rabidly anti-Christian because of the horrible history that is within Christianity. And one of the reasons I get frustrated is that they tend to have latched onto some other human ideology. And the fascinating thing to me is that they're almost incapable of seeing that any evil was ever done with that ideology. That's what frustrates me. All human culture, and this is going to sound conservative perhaps, but all human culture is corrupt. It's all distorted by sin. This is one of those Christian teachings about original sin or the fall. And for me, the fall is not something that happened way in the past. The fall is what's going on all the time. We're sinners. We're broken. We do bad stuff. We're, in fact, capable of an incredible amount of evil in our lives. And not just the kind of the worst of the worst that we might see on the evening news, but that kind of evil lurks in the hearts of each one of us. And so, even something as wonderful as being disciples of Jesus is susceptible to our corruption. And that's why we have to be vigilant. It's one of the reasons we keep coming back to church. One of the reasons I keep coming back to church is that I'm a slow learner. And I have to hear these stories over and over and over again, not just on Sunday, but even sometimes on Wednesday, and even radically on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, too. I have to keep reading these stories and hoping that these stories become somehow part of my story. And it's a struggle. But I don't get too discouraged because I can look to the past and see that struggle in the lives of lots of other believers, and I can look in the present and see the same thing as well. And if the power in that story was just our power, then I would say, it's not enough. We do need the divine power, but then that brings us back to this kind of question of what's divine power look like? What's the nature of divine power? And you probably have to call in a real theologian to try to answer that question, like maybe Dr. Matt Matthews could come in and talk about God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and how that fits with things like evil. I'm just a lowly ethicist. So what I get to do is say, we just believe these things, and then this is how we try to live them out. And how we try to live it out, I think, is that we trust in the power and we keep going. That's kind of a simple response, but it's basically how I keep going, is I trust in the power and I keep going. And what's the power that I'm trusting in? It's a power for things like love and justice and goodness, those kinds of powers. And that's what I see in the story of Jesus. Jesus exercises his power in a way that leads to good rather than evil. And so that's why I kind of trust in his power. Even though I can misunderstand it. I mean, I'm perfectly capable of misunderstanding it. We have time for about one more question, I think. Yes, ma'am. Okay, great. Reverse psychology. think it does. I mean, and I think we're kind of on the same track with that. And you raised something about Jesus being a storyteller, which he was. He was a great storyteller. And of course, the stories, and some of them were in this week's reading of his parables. And one of the great things about the parables is that they're open to interpretation. Even though the way they're told in some of the Gospels, the Gospel writers have added their interpretation, and they put it in the mouth of Jesus. And so that kind of shapes our interpretation sometimes. But the wonderful thing about these parables is that they continuously invite reflection and thought and then different kind of action. And that's why, I mean, I just finished reading this book about the parables. It was written by Amy Levine, who's a biblical scholar at Vanderbilt. And she's Jewish, but she's a New Testament scholar, which I love that combination. And if you read her book on the parables, it really reopens some of those parables in a really interesting way. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything that she's doing, and she wouldn't even necessarily want that, but that she's able to get us to see that the parables are not like the answer, but they're really what they're opening us to important issues that we have to continually mull over. And that's when Jesus' power is really being shared, is that he's not like writing an encyclical like a pope, it says, this is the definitive teaching here. Jesus doesn't write encyclicals, except a little bit in John's gospel. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is a storyteller, and that opens us up to tell those stories as well, and to see how those stories are going to tell our lives as our story. And I think that's a great image for how power gets shared. Even within a family, as we share family stories, it's a handing on of here's how this family works, power, and yet each generation is going to have to retell that story again if that power is going to continue. And as we do retell it, it gets shaped according to what it needs, the ways in which it needs to be shaped in order to remain alive. And I think that's kind of what Jesus does with his stories. So I think we're at the end. So thanks for hanging in there. And next week, I think you have a real biblical scholar coming, so that's good.